There are stories whispered in the dark corners of old Europe that no priest dares to bless, no physician dares to explain, and no mother dares to hear. This is one of them. In the year 1741, in a windswept village nestled in the Carpathian foothills of Hungary, where the wolves howled, not only for hunger, but for grief, there lived a girl named Elizabeth. She was not remarkable at first glance, a thin child with pale fingers and downcast eyes, the daughter of a miller and a midwife. But something in her gaze lingered too long on the crucifix. Something in her silence unsettled even the most devout neighbors. The villagers called her Little Lantern, not for any light she gave, but for the strange glow they swore flickered around her when storms rolled in. Elisabetta was 10 when it began. Fever took her swiftly, a red tide rising behind her eyes, and within 3 days she lay still in her family's cottage. Her mother, Catalin, swore she saw her chest move, just once, after the doctor pronounced her dead. But no one listened to women who screamed at coffins. The doctor, a man named Ferenc, educated in Vienna and full of disdain for peasant superstition, signed the death certificate with clean ink and a cold hand. Febris maligna, he wrote. Malignant fever, nothing unusual, nothing worth delay. They buried her on a Wednesday. Cold rain fell in pinpricks, and the priest mumbled the Latin rites, looking over his shoulder more than at the Book of the Dead. Her coffin was plain pine, unlined, her body wrapped in a woolen sheet. No coins were placed over her eyes, no candle left at her feet. It was as if they wanted to forget her faster than the worms could remember her. But Elisabetta did not forget, and Elisabetta did not die. 3 days after the burial, the gravediggers, apprentice a boy of 13 with a crooked back and a stutter ran screaming through the village square. "She sings," he cried. "She sings beneath the ground." No one believed him. They whipped him for blasphemy and locked him in the church cellar for the night. He refused to sleep. He kept whispering, "She said my name." A week passed. Then, too, the doctor left the village, citing personal illness. The priest grew pale and thin, preaching sermons about hellfire and the sin of despair. And then one evening, as mist rolled low through the valley and the moon hung crooked in the sky like a madman's grin, Cataline heard a knock at her door. It was soft, rhythmic, 3 slow knocks. She opened it and fainted, for standing there barefoot, her burial shroud soaked in dirt and dew, was her daughter Elisabetta, alive, or something like it. The child did not speak at first. She stared ahead, as if blinded, and her lips moved silently for hours. Her skin was mottled with bruises and scratches, her fingernails broken, her eyes bloodshot but aware. They took her in, washed her, burned her clothes. The villagers gathered outside the house with pitchforks and prayers, demanding to know what sorcery had been unleashed. Catalin refused to let them take her. "My daughter lives," she screamed, holding the girl close. "You buried her, and she lives." But when the priest came to examine the girl, he recoiled. "She is not what you remember," he whispered. "This is a shell, an echo, not a soul meant to linger." Still, they did not kill her. Not yet. Instead, they sent for a scholar, a man who studied the old ways, the border between life and death, between spirit and body. The man who came was not what they expected. He wore no robes, only a dark coat and a silver ring etched with runes no one could read. He called himself Horvath, and he did not ask permission to enter the house. He simply walked in, sat before the girl, and said, "Tell me what you remember." And she did. Her voice cracked, dry from thirst and time, but her words were clear. "The earth was heavy. I could not breathe. I screamed until my throat bled. I scratched the lid until my fingers broke. I prayed. Then I heard singing, not mine, someone else, a voice like wind in the reeds. And I saw them." Who asked? "The watchers, the men without eyes. They smiled when I stopped moving. They smiled when I cried." Did not speak for a long time. Then he turned to Catalin and said, "She should not be alive, and yet she is, which means something else has died in her place." That night, the house burned, not from flames, but from within. Walls cracked, windows shattered, and a deep moaning sound echoed through the beams. No fire was seen, but the air reeked of sulfur and roses. Elisabetta stood untouched in the center of the chaos, her hair floating as if underwater. Wrote notes furiously in a leather-bound book, stopping only when his pen snapped mid. Afterward, he sealed the house and demanded silence. "The dead do not return," he said, "unless something has changed in the nature of death itself." Word spread beyond the village. Within a month, men from Vienna arrived. Surgeons, priests, military officers. They called it an incident of interest. They took Elisabetta in an iron carriage and brought her to an asylum built for war criminals. They said it was for her protection. They said it was for science. But some say the girl was not taken. Some say she walked willingly into the carriage, turned back to the villagers, and whispered, "I will remember what you did." The graves in the village never stayed closed after that, and no one sang lullabies again. There were no clocks inside a coffin, no sun, no moon, no rustle of wind or shifting of time. Time was a scream stretched to thin. For little Clara, it had passed in claws and gasps and delirious scraps of prayer, but they had dug her up. Somehow, the moment her nails brushed air and her lungs found space again, the world returned like a savage beast, snapping its leash. They pulled her out, thin arms, bruised mouth, white dress blackened by soil. She emerged from the grave like a thing born wrong. They screamed, of course. The men who'd opened the coffin dropped their tools. The priest whispered a prayer. One man ran until his shadow disappeared behind the trees. And Clara, she didn't cry. She couldn't. Her eyes stared out hollow, sunken, as if they'd traveled too far to ever return. Her mouth moved but made no sound, until, slowly, she whispered something. It was so dark, and the angels never came. Then she laughed, a sound so thin it cracked the air, and fainted. For days, she lay in the rectory, between lace curtains and the stench of wax. The doctor came twice and left both times pale. He said her pulse was real, her breath was warm. But when he held his fingers to her wrist, he swore he could feel the ghost of death underneath. The townspeople couldn't decide what she was. The priest said God had returned her, a miracle or a warning. The gravedigger said she had tricked them all, a witch child, steeped in her mother's sins. Witches could fool the breath from their lungs. The apothecary said it was catalepsy, a condition he'd read of in French medical texts, a paralysis so deep it mimicked death, a rare thing, but real. None of them could agree. But none could forget the sound of nails against wood from below. Clara spoke little. When she did, she talked in fragments, about dreams with no end, about candles that flickered behind her eyelids, about being watched, always watched. "I wasn't alone," she said one night, to the midwife who brought her bread. "There was something breathing near me, not an angel. It wanted me to stop praying." After that, the midwife stopped coming. By now, the story had begun to spread. From the churches of Austria to the courts of Bavaria, people whispered of the dead girl who came back. Some said she was a prophet. Others said she'd been claimed by the devil and returned for unfinished work. The Pope's physician sent a letter inquiring after her. The Prussian embassy offered to sponsor her education. The French newspaper Le Spectre published her name with the headline, "The Girl Who Returned from the Grave." But the village, tight as a clenched fist, began to crumble under the weight of it all. Visitors came, then pilgrims, then lunatics. One night, 3 women broke into the church. They knelt at the altar where Clara had once fainted and began speaking in tongues, saying she had returned to open the gate between life and death. The priest had them arrested, but still they came. By winter, the town was splitting. Half believed Clara was divine, half believed she was cursed. Children were no longer allowed to play near the rectory. The bishop demanded her removed to a convent. The doctor, now fearful of professional ruin, denied he ever declared her dead. Clara watched it all in silence. One evening, as snow swept the hills like pale fire, she asked the priest to take her to her mother's grave. The priest, hesitant but swayed by something in her eyes, a soft pleading he hadn't heard since she'd been a bright little thing, agreed. They went in the early dusk when shadows stretched like memory. She stood before the stone, cold biting her cheeks, and she whispered, "I think I saw her, in the dark." She tried to pull me back. Her hand brushed the stone, but I wouldn't go. I held on. The priest stepped back. That night, the priest wrote a letter, one that would never reach its destination. In it, he described Clara as a girl who has crossed a threshold, meant to remain sealed, and warned that whatever light returned with her is not ours to claim. She was no longer sleeping. Clara, the quiet child, now walked the rectory halls at night, her footsteps soft, bare against stone. The cook claimed she spoke to the statues. The altar boy swore he saw her standing in the graveyard under the moon, whispering names that no longer existed. And then there were the drawings. She drew incessantly, pages of charcoal sketches, coffins from beneath, dirt raining down, faces staring through slats in wood, a black dog with human eyes, a woman in a tattered dress standing just outside the grave, her mouth sewn shut. They burned the drawings, but she made more. Once, she asked the priest what happened to people who were buried by mistake. He lied, said it never happened. She looked at him for a long moment. Then what am I, she asked. He had no answer. When the first child in town fell sick, fevers, hallucinations, muttering Clara's name, the doctor called it coincidence. When the second said she saw Clara in her dreams, people began locking their doors. Then the letters came, from Paris, from Rome, from Edinburgh, scholars, doctors, priests, all demanding a study, an explanation, a confession. But Clara refused to speak. Her silence became its own mythology. The priest begged her to write what she remembered, not for the world, for herself, for her soul. So she did. She wrote a single page, folded it neatly, and gave it to him. He read it, burned it, and never spoke of it again. When asked what it said, he only whispered, "She remembers everything." By spring, the bishop arrived with soldiers. The village, now a battlefield of belief and fear, had reached a breaking point. Clara was to be taken. For her safety, they said, for study. But the air told a different story. A girl buried once might not survive being buried by men again. The priest tried to intervene, but his power had faded like mist. When they came for her, she did not fight. She only looked at the graveyard beyond the rectory and asked, "Will it be dark again?" No one answered. As the carriage rolled away, the village held its breath, and behind her, in the woods, a sound echoed, faint, like breath against coffin wood, or the laughter of something that had waited, and would wait again. The wind howled through the narrow alleys of Eltspark like a warning, but no one listened. Not the barbers with their crimson towels, not the priests with their black Cossacks, not the midwives who whispered secrets into one another's ears after sundown, and certainly not Father Matthias, who stood at the head of the newly dug grave, staring at the simple wooden coffin that contained the girl he had once baptized. Her name was Emily Rausch, daughter of cobbler Linhart Rausch and his melancholic wife, Annegret. She was not supposed to matter, not really. She was not nobility. She did not marry into gold or scandal. She had only ever spoken softly, walked modestly, smiled too rarely, and yet there he stood, presiding over a funeral that would one day stain the conscience of Europe. They had buried her the day after the fever broke up. It was not the plague, they insisted. No buboes, no purple lips, just a sudden descent, confusion, unconsciousness, and then silence. The town physician, a leathery man with calloused hands and a silver tongue, declared her dead within minutes. Her body was cold, but so were many in the Rausch household. She did not breathe, her eyelids would not flutter, she gave no sign, and yet, as the gravedigger nailed shut the coffin's lid, he swore he heard a whisper from within. "I heard her," he murmured to his apprentice, his knuckles white on the hammer. "She said my name." "You're drunk again," the boy replied. But the gravedigger did not drink. The story would have ended there, a child lost in the black soil of Eltspark, were it not for the second burial. 3 nights after Emily's funeral, the cemetery keeper's dog began to howl, not bark, not growl. A howl so low and guttural it made the candles in the chapel tremble. When the keeper rose from his cot and followed the sound, lantern in hand, he found the dog clawing at Emily's grave. The earth was unsettled, not from above, from below. They exhumed her the next morning reluctantly. At first, the town officials protested. Desecration, they cried. Superstition, said the physician. But when they opened the coffin, the chapel fell to its knees. Her nails were gone, torn. Her fingertips were bloodied stubs. Her cheeks bore tear streaks dried into death. Her mouth was open in a scream that none of them had heard. The lining of the coffin had been shredded, clawed at in desperation, as if she had woken up hours after burial and fought the darkness until her heart gave out again. This time, for good. But the strangest thing, the thing they could never forget, was her eyes. They were open. They were not dead. They were not empty. They looked terrified, and yet aware. Emily Rausch, buried alive, had awakened in her coffin, and no one had heard her cries, except the gravedigger, except the dog, and perhaps something else. Word traveled fast in those days, not through newspapers or ink-stained broadsheets, but on tongues dipped in fear. From one town to another, the story of the girl who clawed her way back to death spread like fire across dry wheat. It reached Mainz, Frankfurt, Vienna, and then Paris. Each retelling grew darker. In some versions, Emily was never a girl at all, but a witch with two hearts. In others, she had made a pact with something beneath the ground. But in Elsbach, those who had seen her face knew the truth. No demon screamed like that. No ghost bled beneath its fingernails. No monster cried for its mother as it suffocated beneath a layer of cedar. Her parents collapsed under the weight of shame and madness. Annegret, the mother, refused to eat. She insisted she could still hear Emily scratching behind the walls. One night she slit her own wrists and painted her daughter's name across the bedroom mirror. Lilhart, the father, drank lye and died with his mouth blistered and foaming. They buried them beside their daughter, but far deeper, almost as if the town feared they too might rise. And then came the stranger. He called himself Dr. Baston Moreau, a Frenchman, a surgeon, perhaps a philosopher. No one was certain. He arrived in Elsbach on horseback, his black coat thick with dust, his boots polished and surgical. He spoke with a voice like broken silk, calm, precise, and curious, very curious. He asked about Emily, not with the crass hunger of gossips or the superstition of villagers, but like a man who had been looking for her. She woke. He said to Father Matthias over bitter wine, "You must understand what that means." "I understand what I saw," the priest replied. "No," said Moreau, "you saw what you feared, but what if she had never died at all? What if she entered a sleep so deep that no instrument, no touch, no doctrine could measure it? You speak of trances." "But she was cold, cold," Moreau repeated, "but perhaps not gone." And then he asked the question that made the priest drop his cup. "Did she speak when you reburied her?" "No," whispered the priest, "but I dreamed of her voice. For 7 nights, so did I," said Moreau. The good doctor, if that's what he was, took residence in the rectory. He brought with him instruments no one in Elsbach had seen before, syringes with glass tubes, bells and tuning forks, a black notebook bound in leather, filled with names, dozens of them, all girls, all supposedly dead, all between the ages of 8 and 12. He called it his registry. He asked the town for silence. No more gossip, he urged, or the real story will die, like she did. But Elsbach was already sick with paranoia. The children, especially, began to whisper among themselves. Some claimed they heard Emily humming outside their windows. One boy said she was walking by the river at dawn, her feet bare, her eyes bleeding. A girl fainted in church after seeing a pale shape watching from the bell tower. Fear, once planted, bloomed like mold in damp wood. Then the dreams began. A dozen villagers reported seeing the same vision. Emily, in her coffin, not screaming, not pleading, but waiting, eyes wide, hands folded, as if she knew they were watching her, as if she wanted them to remember her name. Not as a mistake, not as a horror, but as a warning. Dr. Moreau took notes, copious notes. He asked each dreamer for detail. What color was her dress? Did she speak? Was the coffin open or closed? She said something, one old woman insisted, but I couldn't hear it. Moreau nodded. You weren't meant to. Then one night, he vanished. He left no luggage, no payment for his room, no trace, except his notebook, left open on the chapel steps. Inside, the last entry read, "She remembers, and now, so do I." The town, unable to cope with the haunting, sealed Emily's grave with iron. They poured molten lead over the lid. They salted the earth. Some say they even burned the cemetery records, so her name would never be spoken again. But stories have a way of outliving even the most stubborn truth. In the decades that followed, other tales surfaced. Girls who died in rows, children buried too soon, one in Venice, another in Yorkshire. Always girls, always the same age, always remembering, and always whispering the same name, Emily. The day Margarita was finally returned to her father's estate, the village held its breath. It had rained the entire night before, as if the sky were trying to wash away the sins of the earth. The carriage that carried her arrived silently, without escort, and the door creaked open to reveal a girl no longer child, but no longer human either. She stepped onto the gravel in silence, her face pale but set with something unshakable, perhaps memory, or madness, or some terrible fusion of both. Her dress hung on her like robes of mourning. Her eyes, once blue like river water, had faded into a gray that reflected no light. She did not speak at first. She did not cry. She simply walked into the house where she had once died. Herr Dietrich met her with arms outstretched. but she passed him by as if he were a ghost. She walks as though her bones remember the coffin, whispered one of the maids, but Margarita sat before the fire that night and began to speak not of the afterlife, nor angels, nor divine light, but of soil in her teeth, and fingernails torn raw from clawing wood, of the muffled sounds of her name being spoken by priests above her, of screams no one heard, of the way breath tastes when it's the last one you have left. Her story was not one of salvation, but of survival, and the most dreadful part was not that she had died, but that she had lived through being forgotten. A physician came from the University of Würzburg to examine her, under orders from the Archduke himself. He diagnosed her not with resurrection or demonic possession, but with catalepsy, an illness so little understood that it might as well have been witchcraft. The body slows, the breath stills, and the heart beats in whispers. She had been declared dead by the very same science that now claimed her alive. But villagers were not doctors, and most had never heard of catalepsy. To them, she had died and returned. That meant something else entirely. Rumors turned fast. Some claimed she had bargained with the devil, offered her youth in exchange for second life. Others said her family had used black prayers from forbidden books to restore her, and there were those who whispered she had never truly been human at all, but something that wore the shape of a girl, only to return in time and claim vengeance. When livestock began to wither in nearby farms, and a child was born with a clubbed foot, it was Margarita they looked to, no longer with pity, now with fear. Her father tried to keep her hidden, but the house had too many windows. At night, villagers claimed to see her silhouette standing still for hours, staring out into nothing. One boy said he saw her walking barefoot in the churchyard, her feet red with blood, though the grass bore no thorns. Another swore he heard her speak in Latin to herself, though Margarita had never studied it. The human mind, once touched by the coffin, seemed to them like a vessel no longer belonging entirely to this world. And so, they began to gather again, first in whispers, then in churches, then with fire. The priest who had presided over her funeral was summoned, made to stand before a council of villagers. She died, he said. She was cold, breathless, she was anointed, buried. By the grace of God, she found life again. But grace, it seemed, was no longer sufficient for them. They wanted certainty, a monster exposed, a sin punished. So they came one night with torches and ropes, not to kill, but to cleanse, to take her once more to the church, to put the holy water upon her, to ask her questions no child should have to answer. What did you see beneath the earth? What lives inside you now? Margarita said only one thing: I remember. And that was enough to unravel everything. They tried to exorcise her. They bound her hands and laid her upon the altar. The priest, trembling, read the rites, his voice faltering as he reached the words for casting out evil. But nothing happened. No screams, no thrashing, no sign of Satan. Only Margarita, eyes open, lips unmoving, tears falling without sound. The silence was unbearable. It stretched on and on until the villagers began to doubt, were they the ones possessed by fear? Had they buried their own guilt along with the girl? She was returned again to her home, but things had changed. Herr Dietrich, once the town's pride, left the estate within the year. He took Margarita far north, to a sanatorium in Hamburg, where science, not superstition, might shelter her. Some say he never forgave himself. Others believe he began to see visions, two of coffins nailed shut, and eyes that opened beneath the earth. The house fell into disrepair. The villagers, ashamed or afraid, never spoke of the girl again. Her name was struck from the records. The cemetery stone was left to crack. And yet the tale spread, from Germany to France, to Austria, to the British Isles. Newspapers whispered it, doctors debated it, priests warned of it. Was it truly catalepsy? Was it some divine punishment for burying a soul too soon? Or was it proof that the veil between life and death was thinner than a breath, and easily torn by mistake? Margarita herself never wrote a word, but there were those who claimed to have spoken with her later in life, in the sanatorium's garden. She spoke calmly, they said, softly, as if each word were a fragile bloom grown from soil too rich with sorrow. I do not fear death, she said. I fear sleep. One nurse reported that she kept her own coffin near her bed, not out of madness but as a reminder, a wooden box, carved with lilies, that she would touch each morning as she rose, whispering something no one understood. Another claimed she drew maps of her memory of where she lay, of what she heard above, of the sound of dirt falling like rain, and there was a doctor who once tried to hypnotize her to draw out any buried memory. He later left the profession. She remembered too much, was all he would say. In time, she passed this time for real. They say her body was not embalmed, that she insisted upon it, that her final request was to be buried with a bell in her hand, a long silk cord running from her palm to the graveyard keeper's cottage, just in case. And when she was laid into the earth again, all the gravediggers stood in silence. No one spoke the usual prayers. No one moved until the last shovel of soil was placed. For years after, no one dared pass that grave at night. Some said they heard the bell. Others said it was only the wind. But every person who heard her story remembered one thing, that Margarita did not return from the grave with secrets of the afterlife. She came back with the horror of being forgotten while still alive. And in that horror, we glimpsed something darker than death itself. For what could be worse than to die and still be conscious enough to know no one is coming for you?